What is the difference between Christian patriotism and Christian nationalism?
History is, and it happened, and it's interpreted, and it has to be played out in the field of conversation.
Can you be a Democrat and be a Christian?
America is a nation that God can use to do good things.
That was actually the most patriotic thing that they could do.
Nothing else matters.
Welcome to Kingdom Thinking. Today we're going to talk about this, tough topic and trying to parse the differences between Christian nationalism and Christian patriotism. In other words, what does it mean to love your country, to love the opportunities you have here, and yet to hold your faith in correlation and intention with that? So let's jump in.
Yeah, so we know that, in a lot of American evangelicalism, there is a conversation that is happening around this mixture of
at this moment in particular.
There. And there is still, you talk to a lot of people, there's still conversation around like the election being problematic, let's just say, to save the time. And, there's a real big talk about the idea of like the Republican Party being the party of Christians, and evangelicals are the big voting bloc that helped put Trump into the office of the presidency in 2016. And so what some people critique as Christian nationalism, right? Some people think is just Christian patriotism. And so I think it's important that as we define this conversation, wherever you land on it, these terms are a little bit fluid, kind of depending on who's defining them.
True. Yeah.
And so we'll define our terms for the sake of the conversation, and you may not agree fully, but if you disagree with what our terms are, let us know in the comments and tell us why and what they should be, right? Don't just say like, that's dumb, but give us actually something useful here. And so here's what I think of when I think of Christian patriotism, right? Seems to garner support out of like Romans 13, right? Like obedience to the government, thinking that government is, in some way or shape or form put there by God. Jeremiah 29 as well, right? The most often misquoted verse in the New Testament or in the Old Testament. The idea here is like in Jeremiah 29, like God tells the Israelites, even though that they've been carried off into Babylon, into exile, that's like, plant gardens, take homes, or take sons and daughters, for your wives and husbands, for your children, and things like that.
Pray for the welfare of the nation.
Really, like actually invest in the country and hope that it does well, right?
Correct.
And then in 1 Timothy 2, the idea of Christians living peaceably, like amongst each other. And so there's
what principles do you gather from that?
I think the big one is the idea is like being okay with being happy about where you live, thinking that even calling the country that you live in as good, let's say, right? Even the notion of being willing to say that some countries are better than other countries, right, for whatever reason. Like, I think that's probably where, as far as I would go on that, of being able to say, like, it's good when we critique our past, for example, for, like, the massive amounts of atrocities that we committed, but it's also good to recognize the good things that America has done, right, for example. And so being intentional about living in that both-and conversation of America's horrific, ugly warts and her history, and a lot of good things that she's done in terms of, helping the world grow and helping contribute to like food and medicine and things like that as the world has developed. So I think so again, it's a little bit amorphous, right?
Yeah.
There, but the idea of praying for your nation, desire to protect religious liberties, or being glad that we live in a country that has the First Amendment.
Right. That's a good thing.
That is a spectacular thing, not just good. That is a like righteous thing. Voting alongside, biblical convictions of how you see it. So I think these what I would define as Christian patriotism. Right?
So what I gather from that is a religious or biblical perspective that can see America and the American democratic experiment as a vehicle for good. Yeah. But isn't willing to say that it's the vehicle or the only one, or that it's somehow without blemish.
Yeah, it's not the chosen vehicle for God's goodness to spread to the world, right?
Okay.
So, and then we're
going to call that Christian patriotism.
Yeah, and so then we have Christian nationalism as well. And one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of lift Benedict Anderson's political theory about this, right? So a political theorist, Benedict Anderson, describes nations as like these imagined communities, right? And they say here, though nations may be vast in their geography and population, many of us cherish such intense patriotic commitment that we would lay down our lives or the lives of our children to defend our country and to promote its power around the globe. Now, in The Cross of War, Christian Nationalism and U.S. Expansion in the Spanish-American War, Matthew McCullough defines American Christian nationalism as basically an understanding of American identity and significance held by Christians wherein the nation is a central actor in the world historical purposes of the Christian God.
Interesting.
And I think that's the biggest distinction there.
Okay.
The idea that America is a nation that God can use to do good things, and America is the nation that God has purposed for the sake of doing all of the good things, right? And so that simple article switch between a and the, I think, is probably the biggest shifter in the dialogue from one's position as a Christian patriot to that of a Christian nationalist.
Interesting. Okay, good. So as you say that, we're going to use those two operational definitions for the conversation.
Yeah.
Two things come to my mind. One, identity. And two, empire versus kingdom. So let me talk a little bit about this, and I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure.
The first thing that comes to my mind is when you think about who are you, what is your identity in your core? There's a few things that are there. One, you could say, I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm a son. For Christians, part of that central or the most important thing is your identity in Christ, right? As a citizen of heaven, as an adopted child of God. How does that relate to my identity as an American citizen or an American resident, whatever the case may be? I think the way you answer that question is probably telling and is going to distinguish these. So on the one hand, if my identity as an American citizen is as important as my identity as a Christian, or if my identity as a Christian cannot be separated from my identity as an American, that sounds more, as we're defining it, as nationalism.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? That's part of who I am in such a way that it would be hard to separate it or to put a hierarchy.
Yeah, American should never be the descriptive adjective in front of Christian, in my mind.
Okay.
Right.
Gotcha. The distinction would be with Christian patriotism. I live in America. I have the privilege of being an American citizen, which has a lot of really, really good things, right?
It's an absolute privilege in a lot of ways, I don't want to go somewhere else. Like, I like it here. I'm glad I can be here and stay here. And yet, if I didn't have America, my identity wouldn't change. Sure.
There's a tension of gratitude and joy, but also grief and apprehension.
Yeah, naturally.
For what it means to be an American.
Yeah.
And to be honest, confusion. I'm a first generation son of immigrants. My parents were not born here. My parents are citizens, but they don't consider themselves Americans.
Sure.
Like they want to be buried in Honduras.
Yeah.
So when I go to Honduras, my cousins know that I'm not like them.
Yeah.
Because I didn't grow up there. I mean, it's amazing. I love my family and they love me, but they know. Yeah, but you're not.
There's a categorical distinction between the two of you.
And now when I'm here, I'm also not really sure where I fit in, because if and you know, I don't want to overgeneralize, but if I were white, there's a lot of like benchmarks that I could grab onto. If I were black, there's probably also, for better and for worse, right?
Certainly.
A lot of, just geographically and chronologically, a lot of benchmarks that I can trace myself to. But being Latino, my family's only been here for like 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
There's not a lot that, in my mind, conceptually makes me an American citizen, right? And so part of that experience for me personally is how or why conceptually, when I think about what does it mean to be American, well, that can mean a lot of things, but it doesn't even come close or as a priority for what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah.
To be invited onto the table of Christ, where now both the oppressed, the oppressor, the poor, the rich, et cetera, all these dichotomies now get destroyed, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So for me personally, that's a big distinction of how I make sense of that hierarchy in my mind.
Yeah.
But I'd love to get your response on identity.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about empire and kingdom.
Dude, I describe a similar boat, right? So I have the ability to pass, right, in like with no questions asked for being like whiter than Wonder Bread in these conversations, right? And like I being stereotyped as like traditional everything American, you know, red, white, and blue.
Hipster.
But you know, growing up in the Philippines, I remember when we moved home in June of 1995, I had no desire to come here. I thought this was the stupidest place in the world because it was like my whole life and everything that I had known was 7,000 miles away in the Philippines. And so for me to come to America was an invasive pulling me out of the only world I knew to come to a place where I didn't fit in, right? Like I didn't speak the colloquial language. I didn't, more people looked like me, which was strange. It was a different experience, because growing up in the school that I went to, I was the only white kid in my class, and really some of the only other white kids that I remember growing up around with my brothers. So I share a similar feeling of not really knowing where I belong, right? Because for me, even at a young age, I remember one of the times my dad read the passage out of Galatians, right, where there's neither Jew or Greek or Gentile in Galatians 3. And we would talk about so much about going home to America there, and my parents would use that language as if it was like this ubiquitous thing that we all shared, and it wasn't a framework for myself and my middle brother or my eldest brother. None of us would relate to that, and it exposed itself one time at Thanksgiving dinner, right, where my mom was cooking us American Thanksgiving dinner, and we all got livid because there was no rice, right? And so we were so used to rice at every single meal. And so those small things have always functioned as benchmarks for me about not really feeling like I fit in here, because so much of what I love in my childhood is from over there. And so, but I still get the enjoyment and all the privileges of being, white over here. And so I think the thing that's always been most important to me is that attachment as a follower of Jesus. Like that Galatians 3 passage has been a thing that's really been written on my heart for a long time. Like nothing else matters to me other than just being a follower of Christ. I don't care. Like I've never, ever put my identity as an American with my identity as a Christian, right? Like it's like mixing oil and water. Like there's no point to try and put those things together in my brain.
Interesting.
So I don't have I have the advantage of being white and being able to assimilate into this culture, no questions asked, but I don't have the mental side of that comes with that. I don't have the mentality that comes with that there. And, my parents were always very intentional as white people about the churches that we grew up in were predominantly minority churches, right? Like the Filipino church that I grew up in when we moved back here. Yeah. So it's like, I didn't even know Orange County existed until I got to high school and we moved out here because my dad took a different job. And I was just like, what the heck, dude? It's like this place is totally different than anything I grew up in. There's a lot more white people here. And so, it feels weird to me as well.
That's super interesting. So in that sense, that's funny that we're more alike than not.
Sure.
And the word that came to my mind was displacement.
For some certainly.
Reason. And so I think of the passage in 1 Peter, to those who are displaced. Yeah. You're foreigners, you're exiles, you are people who are sojourners.
Yeah,
right?
Certainly.
One of the translations. I wonder how much of that we can bring to the table and say, like, no, this is how it should be.
Sure.
And I realize that depends on a lot of things. One thing that depends on is how optimistic or pessimistic you are about American history.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
And so the more optimistic you are about America being specifically founded as a nation with Christian principles and in the vein of honoring God and things like that, then you're probably going to feel more compelled and or find warrant for like.
Are you signing up for the 1619 Project view of history or not? Right, like that's really what we're talking about at this point. Yeah, for sure.
And I think that I want to. I hold that intention because on the one hand, I do feel a little displaced.
Yeah.
That I love this place. I can have job opportunities, the education.
Yeah, certainly.
And even like economic advancement that my parents probably could never imagine.
Yeah.
And that is a huge testament to the blessings that we have here.
Yeah.
That is amazing. And I'm not going to apologize for that. I don't want to be anywhere else.
Right.
I love it here.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's a tension between mourning and grieving what this place has been and what it still is in some ways, right? And so my question is like, so how do I own that personally and then in a community, and how do I contextualize that from the perspective that I'm not just a citizen of the society, I'm also Christian. I'm a citizen of a new society, right? And those aren't the same thing.
Right.
A good friend of mine wrote an article. His name is Brandon Hurlbert. Shout out. He's doing his PhD in Old Testament in Durham. And he wrote this article that I really liked where he distinguishes between empire and kingdom. And he says, kingdom is the way of power and the way of rule of God, where from the new society, which is not by means of the sword, by the way,
right?
But it's by the cross, at least until Jesus comes back. There's a compulsion. There's a winsome. There's an attractiveness to this new society that says you get to sit at the table. Why? Because we're all equally broken.
Yeah.
And so whether you're from, I don't know, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, New Zealand, it doesn't matter. That somehow is so irrelevant all of a sudden.
Right.
Now, granted, I understand there's economic, political realities,
sure.
and then we cannot just dismiss those.
Sure.
I get it. But distinguishing that view that we're calling kingdom with empire, meaning which vehicle do we use to get political, economic things done?
Yeah.
Like those are both questions we need to answer, and we can't skip over them. But to confuse the two would be the mistake.
Yeah, for sure, certainly.
And I think ultimately that's the point of analysis that I think is necessary for Christians in this tumultuous time, where so much of our witness, so much of our influence has come into question.
Yeah.
And there's so much work that Christians we're in the hot seat.
Well, when evangelicals are known more as a voting bloc than they are a religious group.
Exactly.
That's, in my estimation, that's hugely problematic.
Right. To continue to talk about some of these differences and problems, it seems that Christian patriotism on the one hand is willing to acknowledge and accept, even maybe criticize America's past, or even like the Republican Party.
Yeah, for sure.
Can you be a Christian and criticize the Republican Party, or can you be a Christian and not be a Republican?
Yeah.
There would be a lot more willingness to have that conversation, or to be compelled by that, by a Christian patriot, as we're understanding that word. And then with Christian nationalism, it seems that the optimism with which American history is seen doesn't allow to leave the framework where there's things that need to be corrected. And I don't know, is that unfair to say?
No, I think it's right. I think it's exactly right on to say, right? I mean, you spend 10 minutes on any, right, like evangelical Facebook discussion, and it's going to be a conversation of like how you can't vote for the Democratic Party and be a follower of Jesus, right? Like those two things are just mutually exclusive there. And that's, obviously that's a major oversimplification.
Yeah.
But that's the popular parlance in the dialogue that we're discussing there. Okay. And this is important to recognize, because it's like Christian patriotism, right, would look at that and say, I mean, the Republican Party has egregious flaws in the same way that Democrats do. Like, God's not stoked on abortion, right? Like, I don't care what you say, abortion's not cool in God's perspective. But also, the lack of like racial justice conversations that don't really tend to happen in the right, or from the Republican Party, is also problematic, right? Like, the idea here of being optimistic or pessimistic about America's history, America's current climate, is the wrong lens in my mind through which to view these things, right? Because looking at something optimistically or pessimistically is like a weird framework to apply to history, right? Like, the idea here is like, history is, and it happened, and it's interpreted, and it has to be played out in the field of conversation there. But if we get to one side or the other, we end up in the same trap, just on a different side of that coin, essentially, right? Like, we're a lot better than you think we are. Like, we need to go. We just ignore the other thing. It's like, oh no, like, we're really, really, really bad. And it's like, well, we also do like a lot of good in history too, and as far as America's concerned. And so it's like looking at things and trying to be as conscientiously objective as possible, which means measuring your biases, measuring, your skin color plays a role in how you understand this country, like measuring opportunities over and against other parts of the world. Like, all of those things need to be the foundational pieces by which we're measuring stuff.
Yeah.
They're not just like the optimism versus the pessimism discussion there. Otherwise, the wedge, right, that we're seeing between nationalism and patriotism is going to get further apart, and we're not going to be able to, unify evangelicalism back together, and there's just going to be a weird another schism in evangelicalism.
Yeah, and on that, that's something I've been thinking a lot lately, because like yourself, right, you mentioned two big hot button issues, right? Abortion or reproductive rights on the one hand, and then something like racial equality on the other hand, right? Why am I made to feel like, as a Christian, like I have to pick a side?
Right.
Why can't I care about both?
Yeah. Lecrae is a Christian rapper who just went through this recently, right? Like, he performed at a Raphael Warnock party or inauguration portion. And, dude, a lot of white Christians got super upset at him, right? And there was like this movement like, Lecrae's not a Christian anymore. And it's like, because he performed at a Pastor Warnock, who's like considered a communist and like ultra liberal, whatever, they're like who supports abortion and things like that on the Democratic platform. And like Lecrae has made videos about saying like, hey, I don't support abortion, but I feel like, you know, the Democrats have more in line for what's important to me and the gospel that I read. And it's like, there's no room for a person like Lecrae in this discussion that we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's pathetic. It's true because it's a lack of ability to do critical thinking.
Correct. So my instinct then to say is the way that these issues are being played out, Christians are forced to either feel like they have to stand up and fight for their rights. So that's one option. Or latch onto a progressive set of values because, it's a mixed bag, but there's enough good in there where I'm willing to buy it. So like kind of being passive about it or fight for your rights.
Yeah, it's either I'm not voting for a pastor, I'm voting for a president. Or it's like, you know, abortion's not good, but at least there's whatever. At least I care about the poor that are already here. It's like, dude, it's a false dichotomy fallacy.
Yes, and I would say, I think to limit the response of how to be a Christian in America to those two things would be to play by the wrong rules.
Yeah, of course.
And so I think increasingly the conviction that I'm coming to is I'm not going to bend the knee to either one, and I don't want to, at least intentionally, feel like those are the only two ideologies or the only frameworks or perspectives that Christianity can live in and flourish in, right? I keep coming to this example of Christianity as this new society that is over and against or subversive or in tension with the way of the kingdom or the way of the empire.
Certainly.
It's different. So towards some pastoral issues and pastoral questions where this would play out, I mean, think about this. Can you be a Democrat and be a Christian?
Sure, why not?
I mean, you understand how in so many places that would be a definitive no, right?
Yeah, and it's dumb in those definitive places.
Right. Well, so furthermore, I would say I don't want to just be a Democrat and be a Christian if that's how I align. I want to be more than a Republican.
I would
more than a Democrat.
I would challenge every Christian to register themselves as an independent there, right?
See, there you go.
Because
it has to be more than the dichotomies.
Of course, because you get stuck. And by the way, George Washington himself was against the two-party system that we ended up falling into, but that's a whole nother conversation. And so it's like the idea here is like voting for the lesser of two evils is still voting for evil. There.
Right.
So if you want to see a major change or a major difference, then a lot of people have to make a major decision to move in a majorly different direction.
Right.
There. And that's neither Democrat nor Republican.
Exactly.
Pretty much.
So in that vein, should Christians feel more compelled by convictions that more align with their views, either on left or right, there needs to be room to discuss that.
Yeah.
Good. How should we be proud, or how can you be proud of your country?
Yeah, I'm super proud of America when she lives up to the ideal, right? So it's like when the Declaration of Independence was written in the end of in the 1700s, right? The idea was like that was not true in the time that it was written, but that doesn't mean that the spirit of it is something that we still shouldn't pine after and try and ascertain with the totality of our might as people, right? And so it's like, what do we need to do? What steps must we take to make this a more free, a more equal, a better nation for all people? Like that's a heck of a goal to strive for. And what it means inherently is that we will always be tinkering, right? We will always be trying to make things better. And that can make people nervous or uncomfortable because that automatically means there's always going to be some type of progress or some type of progression that needs to occur or shift or change or go back on whatever there. And that makes people, people don't like change as a whole. And then when you try and supersize it for 350 million people in a country, like that's hard to do.
For sure. So I see one of two things that could be happening in the near future for Christians. I think on the one hand, there could be kind of like an awakening and saying we need to emancipate ourselves as a voter bloc. Yeah. That we need to transcend the economic and political interests of this country if we are going to continue to be influential. That has to happen. Yeah. On the other hand, it could also be the case that America is going to continue to move away from traditional Christian values or whatever, and maybe even be hostile towards. And at that point, that's going to be the proving ground. Like, are you really all in or are you not? Yeah. And so I would say both of those things are good things. Because it's going to weed out people who maybe aren't as convinced that this is something you're willing to die for. And on the other hand, it's going to refine the faith. So we can look forward to both of those things.
Yeah, one way or the other, man. But
awesome. Good stuff. Leave us a comment. What do you guys think? Are we defining these fairly? Patriotism versus nationalism? What are the limitations and benefits of either one? We'd love to hear from you guys, and make sure you tune in next time on Kingdom Thinking.